Hello and welcome back to Shy Talk, an Irish history podcast. We disappeared for the last couple of weeks. It was Christmas and everyone got sick, so I took a few weeks off. But we're back with this is a kind of bonus episode I recorded with a friend of mine, Kevin Dolan, who also runs an Irish history podcast called The History of Ireland. And we recorded this a couple of weeks ago. We decided to do an episode about Harry Boland. So this is the bonus episode to kick off 2024, and we'll have our regular episode out in a couple of days. But we have got live shows that are coming up soon. So there'll be a link to all of those in the description, or whichever ones we've confirmed so far. But there'll be more on the way, but I think there's one in Dublin in early February, so there'll be tickets for that. And if you like live podcasts, we're also hosting the Troubles podcast in 4 Dame Lane in Dublin at the end of the month. So if you're a fan of this show, you've probably been recommended the Troubles podcast. If not, you should check it out and then come see it live in Dublin at the end of the month. But that's it. Sorry we disappeared, but I'd do it again. And we probably will, but we're back for now with a fun episode about Harry Boland, and I'll chat to you soon.
Gather around now, you're in for a story. Old tales of lore, all in search of a glory. The history and mystery of lads, lasses and all. Discoveries and voyages, the rise and the fall. Follow me now as we go back in time. We trace the steps of Irish lineage to find Joseph from Carlow and Kevin the Dog.
Yeah, I was looking up, it was quite interesting. I went down a little bit of a Jack Yates rabbit hole. Because he painted Boland's funeral, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. He won Ireland's first Olympic medal, or thereabouts.
Yeah, I saw that. Don't you miss those days when you could just casually be a painter and Olympic medalist, and you were rich enough that it was like, well, what are you going to do for a living? It was like, well, my older brother's decided to be a poet. I think I'll be a painter.
Yeah. He's already got poet, so the family needs like another painter type. His brother's a real pervert. We did a whole story about him, and he is.
Would he be cancelled today, would we say?
Oh my god, yes. He spent a lot of time just like following Maud Gonne around
and then tried to marry his sister. It was like, oh, I can't get you, I'll get...
No, he proposed to her daughter.
That's what it was. Even creepier.
Even worse, yeah. And I can't remember her dad's name now. He's a big 1916, like a big revolutionary guy.
Yeah.
And he just spent the whole time like talking shit about him.
As you would.
Yeah. He's this is a good conspiracy theory I want to get going now, because he's still really popular here. Obviously, he wrote a lot of good poems. No denying that. There's Yeats Water. You might have missed that trend.
Yeats Water.
That's happened probably since you left.
From like Sligo.
It's just like W.B. Yeats Water. It's like boxes of water that are named after Yeats.
The fact that they didn't call it Water B. Yeats is...
That's maybe what the W stands for. But because when you see it, it looks like it's a series, like a water bottle series that each water bottle is named after a different poet. But it's just him. I haven't seen any other ones. It's just Yeats. In Sligo, there's a memorial to him. His grave is out there. But after reading about his life, I don't think that he's buried there.
Really? Because I went to the grave when I was back there. We were just driving through Sligo. It's like, let's go see.
What's his inscription? Horseman passing eye over.
Yeah,
it's pretty good, whatever it is. But I don't, because he died in France during World War
II. Yeah, he would have been alive.
And I'm only half remembering this. This is from ages ago, but there's something like he died. He died over there, and they put him into a pauper's grave. Essentially, and then with all of the Nazi and all of the France being occupied,
they didn't have
stuff got moved around. he got thrown into a communal grave kind of thing.
Yeah, wow.
And then when they came to like claim his bones and repatriate him, They had no idea which Bones it was.
So they just picked a few.
They picked a few, and it was Sean McDermott, who was the Minister for Foreign Affairs at the time, who was Maud Gonne's son. So, like...
He probably didn't have a big
He
man.
had no love for the man. He didn't like the man. And there's lots of accounts from the time, like his friends went over to visit him, and like the bones didn't make any sense. They just picked some random bones and buried them in Sligo.
Kind of like when they make up dinosaurs, they had just like, he had tiny little hands and a tail and things. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, several more arms than he should have. But yeah, I don't think he's buried there. But Jack I went to see his stuff was in the National Gallery there.
Yeah, I remember years ago seeing some of his stuff, and it's cool. Was he a creep, or was he just quietly a painter? Probably.
Well, no, actually, because there's one painting of his I remember that's just him on a bench. It's all dark, and there's like there's a light source in the background fading off. It's after his wife died. It's the saddest painting I've ever seen. No man who could paint that sad. My wife's dead, and now the world is dark. He can't be a pervert.
Well, they would say anyone who could write so pretty as Yeats also wouldn't be, but
that's true. Too many flowery words.
The Waterboys have a good album actually of Yeats poems put to song, and it works surprisingly well.
He's great for pop culture references. He gave us No Country for Old Men.
Yeah.
And that Sopranos episode or two.
I know Leonard Cohen was a big fan.
Sure. Listen, I'm not saying he's obviously talented. He's just
one of those separate the man from the art kind of vibes.
Yeah, one of the every day there's another one. It's just another in the long list of
creepy
guys.
Men.
Another. Oh, is he a great artist? Oh, is he also a pervert? But yeah, he's good. But why were we talking about Jack Yates?
Because how did we get on Jack Yates? Because he painted Harry Boland. That was it.
Oh yes,
Harry Boland's funeral.
Yeah, and Harry Boland's the topic.
Yes, let's do it.
We're going to talk about.
Let's talk about Harry Boland. We're here. Let's do it. This is the history of Ireland and Shite Talk history crossover episode.
Oh yeah, we've been working on it for 7 months.
I'd say working on it or procrastinating it is really depending on how you want to look at it.
Though I can't procrastinate as part of the work process.
It's all part of the process. So shall we introduce?
Well, my name is Kevin. That's a good introduction. Well, I'm one of the two people that run Shite Talk, an Irish history podcast, which is this is sort of name you come up with when you're 15, but it works sometimes. And yeah, we kind of cover every aspect. I'm just trying to think of the last couple of episodes have just been about. We did one about Joe Dolan. We've been doing a lot of Irish mythology stuff over the summer. We kind of took the summer off and did a lot of myth stuff.
Cool.
To keep ourselves occupied. But you're hyper focused on one specific period of Irish history.
Yeah, I feel so. My name is Kevin. I do the imaginatively named The History of Ireland podcast, which is also probably a name you would come up with when you were 15. And yeah, I love your show because you guys bounce around and find sort of the fun, interesting little bits from all over. Me, I was quite methodical. I was quite boring in that I wanted something that was very chronological. I had found that a lot of shows or a lot of documentaries took a lot for granted and jumped around, like your 1916 and then your Civil War, and then you they didn't fill out the details. And I love getting into the really specific stories that happened in this not-so period that is sort of 1917 through to 1922. I thought I would do maybe 10 episodes on that period. I'm now, I don't know, coming up close on maybe 80, 100. And still only at 1922. I think we've covered about 5 years. But yeah, that's the show.
I think the two shows have been running for it's about the same time.
Yeah, I think just before COVID, so 4 years, 4 and a bit years.
Yeah. which is mad.
Well, because for listeners to know, this is not our first time on a radio show together. We did a great show way back in the day in Dublin City University. And I thought it was so funny. I'd come up with this original idea for let's do a Irish history podcast. There are many others. And then I found out that my mate, also known Kevin, was also doing an Irish history podcast.
Yeah. Which I don't know what the odds of that are. Well, you were living in Australia at the time.
Yeah, just to make things even more confusing.
Yes. But we both went to different sides of the world. And maybe Liam copped on first. That was like, oh yeah, the two.
I think so.
Both Kevins have gone off to different continents and started Irish history podcasts at the same time. But yeah, but now we've come back together to talk about Harry Boland.
Yeah, well, the reason I wanted to talk about Harry Boland, because he's with a short 15-minute podcast like mine, even though it's quite detailed, some people get left on the chopping floor. And sadly, and maybe it was a bad take on my own part, poor Harry Boland is one of those people that I haven't touched on at all in the show. And he's a fascinating guy. He seems like one of the most fun, friendly revolutionaries from the period. So I thought it would be a good one to do with a comedian like yourself.
Sure. He's almost the definition of a guy getting left on the editing floor. Like his whole persona seems to be just being second fiddle to like either Dev and well, I guess he seems close to Dev and Collins. Well, we'll get into it, I suppose, but different points. You know, he's kind of in both of their shadows, and he only seems to exist in the context of one of those two men.
Even more so than the likes of, I feel like even Richard Mulcahy, who is the, like, I always think of the guy in the shadows, or the guy who gets overshadowed. Yeah. Even Richard Mulcahy overshadows poor Boland.
But Boland is his own. He has his own interesting bits.
Yeah, let's do it.
Did you want to? I literally only realized this when we started this call. Like our Facebook page, which we never use, the cover photo is Harry Boland, Mike Collins, and De Valera. All the time we were talking about this, I only copped that on a few minutes ago.
That's so funny.
Yeah, it's a great photo. There's the three of them just. Look at them, three happy boys.
And he does just look like the happiest of them. He looks devilish, I always think.
He does. He looks there like he's doing an impression of somebody for the two lads.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll get started with him, I guess.
Yes.
So he was a Phibsborough lad, and his parents were actually both born in Manchester, if I have that right. But he came from old Fenian stock. A really interesting little note I found was his granddad, I think, on his mother's side, Philip Woods, was actually involved in the 1798 rising. And Boland used that name, Philip Wood, as an alias anytime he traveled through the States or wanted to hide himself. So he really, I think he had a real sense that he held his grandfather up, and his father was involved in some IRB stuff as well. And I think he really wanted to emulate them. And so, like a lot of lads in his time, he got quite heavily involved in the GAA, and through that got into that kind of revolutionary movement. The whole family were in on it. His mother, his sister, his brother were all big fans of the old republicanism. He had an interesting, and if we jump straight to the rising, he had quite an interesting rising. He missed the start. There's stories that he was at the races on the Monday and was kind of him and hawing whether he was going to get involved. He knew that it was going on, more so than other people. He was in the IRB at this point and quite connected to that. When the volunteers had split, Boland had stayed part of the volunteers, but that side that didn't go with Redmond.
Yes. So
Harry didn't side with Redmond and sort of stayed in that small, more militant subsection of the volunteers. And so, was quite heavily involved in the IRB and knew the rising was coming. But he still missed the start because the races were on.
Which is funny, just people's idea of the revolutionaries from that time. I always think of them as being like, you go into any old pub and all of their faces are bronzed up there together as if they're just one big coherent team, when really it's like this hodgepodge of leftist socialist ideas and just fringe elements living in the city. And then their followers, like the majority of the troops at the time head off at Redmond to go fight in World War One and show those Huns what for. And then the guys that are left behind of that are like the real fringe of the
the real fringe of the fringe.
Fringe of the fringe. And even of them, not all of them are involved in the rising. So it's like the people who actually show up are like such a small part of even to be joining a military, like a fake military, and marching around, you've got to be pretty out there. And this is the section of the out there folk who didn't go to the war. And even of that, it's the subsection of those guys who actually. And
I think that was
did something.
And I think that was the thing. Boland was always very much in the subsection of extremists.
Sure, with a family like that, yeah.
Yeah, and the whole family was like the history of it. So he spent most of the rising smashing through a bunch of shops and houses to build a tunnel from one area to the other. And was going along, getting that done, and then eventually was just told to surrender. So he had a bit of a weird rising. There's one quote from his biography that he was like, he had been fired on by his comrades, accused of desertion, implicitly rebuked for obeying an order to retreat, primed for suicidal mission, only be ordered to surrender, and assigned the inglorious task of smashing, tunneling, and sewering.
Okay.
So a lot of fun. But even then, everyone talks about how good-natured he was, how optimistic he was, his energy, and how much fun he was. That he really seemed to gain a lot of followers or got a clout in that rising, even as a small sort of foot soldier that he was.
Yeah, just for being good crack.
Just for being good crack, exactly.
Fair enough.
And so then he got arrested like a lot of them. And again, similarly to the likes of Collins, it was within the prisons that, again, that good-natured energy sort of shone through, and people sort of marked him as this guy will go places within the Republican movement. And so he came back out in 1917 as a bit of it had done wonders for his Republican career, getting locked up.
Yeah, which is such a, it's exactly what you wouldn't want to be doing if you're like putting down a rebellion. All credit to the British Empire. You go in, boats, shoot everybody, execute the leaders. And then you round up the rest of the guys and just put them together in a camp.
And again, the most extreme...
Basically unsupervised.
And the most extreme lads, fringe lads, who before had kind of had to meet in secret or didn't even know who was on side, put them all in a big clubhouse for a few years. And I read somewhere that he gained credit for pulling tricks on the guards and just being annoying.
It does seem like they're just let sort of, run military drills, practice speaking Irish, get up to hijinks.
I could imagine a great like Hello meets Mashed sitcom meets Blackadder sitcom about some lads locked up in a prison camp in Frongruk.
Yes, Hogan's Heroes or Harry Boland's Heroes. It's there somewhere. But yeah, how do you pronounce it? Frognock?
I go Frongok, but I could be wrong.
Sure.
I'm not much of a Welsh speaker.
No one's going to pull you up on him.
So then I think that's the kind of the very early stuff, and I think Boland gets more interesting, similar to Collins, once the war starts, the War of Independence sort of starts rolling. And am I right in saying his first exciting thing was the 1919 prison break?
Well, his first exciting thing is that he became a small business owner. I found he opened a tailor shop in around, I think, early 1918. Harry Boland's high-class tailoring, lay and clerical work.
Oh.
On Abbey Street. So that's, I don't know, I find it funny that the ad said that that's just the two types of work that there is. It's there's enough priests that need stuff washed that it's like a defining feature. But yeah, I guess maybe his first big foray. So him and Collins come back from Frognock along with the rest of them, and basically it's the new IRA. So in 1916, all the leaders have been rounded up, including Dev, but De Valera gets released because he's an American citizen and no one wants to annoy the Americans during World War One. So he's released, but then in May of 1918, he's arrested along with 70 other figures who are all accused of helping the Germans plot to invade Britain. I guess anti-German fear is still at an all-time high in 1919. Now, I'm pretty sure this is made up. They just used it as an excuse to round up all of these sort of Irish figures.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, there was very little proof for the German plot, but we won't go into it.
Yeah. Considering like there was a literal German plot, like he had done that before, and would kind of court it again. So it's not, in principle he could have done it, but I don't think he did it this time. So they get sent to Lincoln Prison in Lincolnshire, along with a whole host of other guys. And at some point, Dev announces that he wants to escape. Well, he announces to the Fenians that he wants to escape, and he says he wants to do it to embarrass the British as opposed to
to get out
prison. Yeah, of course. The reason most people want to get out of prison. But he said he's lofty ideas about like there's a post-World War peace summit in Paris, and Dev wants the Irish question, as they call it, to be on the discussion, and he figures if he escapes and gets there in time, that they'll have to talk about it, which is pretty bold.
And I think it's a great example of how much Dev used prison as a political tool, like both being in prison, getting out of prison, like it was a huge political tool for him.
Because the prison doesn't sound that bad. I mean, I think initially they're treated quite badly because people believe the plot. The prison guards believe the plot and the prisoners. And then after a while, it turns out it's probably bullshit. And then they sort of become exempt or kind of political prisoners, I suppose.
Yeah, it's kind of treated laxly.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories of them, sitting around listening to record players and smuggling whiskey into the place. But he still wants to escape anyway. There's multiple different stories about how he does it. I think it's purposely, there's multiple versions of it that go out.
Again, the propaganda,
and I think also to try and cover how they do prison breaks. You don't want to make that public. But there's very diddly eye versions of it where he's like singing the escape route out the window to like Fenians who are hiding in nearby bushes, and they're singing back and forth. But whatever way, they do break out. I think the real way he does, he makes a mold of a key. He gets a copy of the key and sends it out. They smuggle it out in a drawing to the boys on the outside, who are led by Michael Collins and Harry Boland. So
yes,
it's the two of them that are leading this prison break effort. And again, even the actual prison break, I think a lot of it is confused by the Michael Collins movie.
Yeah,
which is fairly one-sided, as you would imagine, for a film that's named after one of the. In the debate between De Valera and Collins, Michael Collins does fall very much on the Collins side. But in that, as part of the prison break, Dev is dressed up as a lady of the night in order to help him escape, which I don't think that happened at all. But Boland is there as well. He's played by Aidan Quinn in the film. But I guess this is his first big international. Well, I suppose he was apart from fighting in an actual war, this is his first kind of big act of disruption. I guess he helps break De Valera out of prison. They cut a hole in the fence, use a secret key, and sneak him off.
And again, as you say, it became a big propaganda coup for the Irish, and it did, as De Valera wanted, embarrass them. This was one of the things that Harry Boland was very good at, was propaganda and telling that story and making sure the right story got told. And you see that again and again through his career, and through which America we'll jump into in a minute. He's very good at, he could see the power of actions and how that could be translated into great stories.
Yeah, he does seem to be a very charming man.
Mm-hmm.
What do you want to talk about? Yeah, his time in America then?
Yeah, let's do it.
I didn't know that then. You were saying he uses his ancestors' name as an alias when he's over in the States.
Yeah, which I just thought was a really cool little tidbit. And so Boland was sent over with Dev to be sort of Dev's right-hand man, his chauffeur, his assistant, his kind of everything. And they kind of are doing two different jobs, as I understand it. Is they're playing that propaganda game, telling that story and getting America on side, but also working with the American Irish revolutionary groups to get money and guns over to Ireland. And Boland was a master gun runner by all accounts.
Yes, he brought the Tommy gun to Ireland. So it's that famous 1920s gangster Tommy gun. Some of the first ones in the world were deployed in it's hard to, I mean, we love claiming stuff to be the first and all that kind of. You do see it written a lot that it was the first uses of the Tommy gun were in Ireland during the War of Independence, and that they were brought over by Boland. But the two of them, so Dev does like a victory lap of the States, fresh out of prison, to kind of drum up support for the boys back home. Kind of get recognition for Ireland they're trying to get recognition for Ireland as an independent state, and also raise money for future war efforts, basically,
which is something that Boland was put in charge of, was managing that bonds and that money and getting it back to to Ireland, which was, it's one of those things that gets sort of said in a sentence, and Boland managed the money, but was a really complicated task.
Sure, yeah. Well, there's another guy. I just want to bring in this other guy because it'll come up later in the story. It was initially that job belonged to Dr. Patrick McCartan, who was he was a Tyrone man and traveling around in this entourage with De Valera, and he's a very funny character in that. So you've probably covered like the Lauren gun running and like the arming of the UVF and all that kind of stuff.
Touched on it, but not much.
Okay. Well, basically, Home Rule's coming in. That spooks the UVF, and they bring in a lot of weapons from Germany, and it's known as the Lauren gun running. But during that, there's this really funny, I don't know, kind of ideological thing where a lot of the Fenians, a lot of the IVF, and we're talking about like Redmond's crew and that sort of stuff earlier on, and like Owen McNeill and the Irish Volunteers, a lot of them see it as a good thing that the UVF have armed themselves, even though they're arming themselves to like fight them. Irish Volunteers, some of them see it as a good thing because it's like the ultimate expression of what they want to do, and from a purely ideological point of view, they're like, this is good, this is what we should be doing. And Patrick McCartan takes it to the extreme, and there's a story of him lending his car to some UVF guys to go pick up guns. So even though they're going to use those guns against him and his family, he's like, I don't agree with what you're doing, but on a principled level, here's my car, here's a full tank of petrol, just drop it back to me when you have the guns. And which is insane, but on some level kind of commendable. But anyway, he runs for election then afterwards in 1918.
I don't agree with you shooting you, but I believe you have the right to shoot me, kind of thing.
Yeah, he's the ultimate right to bear arms. But the good people of South Armagh, he ran for election there like 2 years later, and they did not forget that he helped them run these guns. But he's kind of Dev's right hand man in the States, and then Dev, I kind of cut this bit out of the script, but Dev, these guys right around. So they're doing the going around to kind of collect the money for the boys back home, but also they're doing a kind of we're a real country, acknowledge us kind of thing, which is how they fall in with the Russian delegates who are also there at the same time doing the same thing. But we'll talk about those guys in a few minutes.
And I'll jump in there because there's a great story on that note of trying to be seen as a real country and siding with these various different fringe groups like the Russians you mentioned, and we'll dive into them. There's an amazing story, and I'm sure you've seen the famous photo of De Valera in the Native American headdress where Boland and Dev go and meet the Ojibwe people, who are this tribe in America, and apparently it really opens up Boland's worldview. It kind of clicks for him that it's not just Ireland. The entire the empire and colonialism is affecting everybody. And he writes in his letters that it was like this real moment of we need to create a kind of global, unified fighting force against colonialism. At a time when we didn't, not many people thought like that. And he actually gave guns to the Ojibwe people, and it said it meant a lot to them because this was a sovereign, something that believed itself as a sovereign state, the Republic of Ireland, giving guns to the Ojibwe nation that was also wanted to be seen as a sovereign state. So it was like these two little oppressed people kind of ignoring the big America and England and supplying guns to each other. Now, it was only something like 5 rifles, or if even that, but it was a really important ceremonial thing. And I was chatting to a historian who was interviewing the Ojibwe people, and they still have the guns that Harry Boland lent to them, which I think is amazing.
It is, yeah, and it definitely does lend to his status as a expert gun runner. It seems, I didn't put that together. I forgot that he was in the famous photo of Dev wearing the ceremonial headdress. But that also seems at odds with if you're trying to appease or cozy up to the Americans.
Yeah.
The kind of last thing you should be doing is giving weapons to the First Nation people. But yeah, fair play to them.
Where were I? Interrupted you. You were about to talk about the Russians.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, there is this kind of World War I shakes up the state of the world, I guess, and there's a lot of new countries born, a lot of old countries fade away, and the Russians, they have their revolution in the middle of World War One, and they are now trying to look for. It's kind of, I'm sure there's a fancier term for it, but basically, you can say you're a country, but the only way you're really a country is if everyone or a majority of people acknowledge you as such. So they're all kind of doing the same thing. But Dev, in February 1920, Dev makes a big speech. The Americans are a bit concerned about the fact that Ireland, because America and England are allies, and they're a bit concerned about the fact that Ireland keeps inviting people over to invade England. The Germans being, which is fair. In World War One was the Germans, and then before that it was the Spanish and the French and the Vikings and anyone who showed an interest. And Dev has a famous speech, which is a good point. He's like the fish in the maw of one shark does not trouble about the possible advent of another shark. The mouse quivering in the jaws of the cat does not fear the approach of a terrier, but if anything welcomes it. Which is, he's basically like, yeah, we will keep doing that, but if we're an independent Ireland, we won't care. The reason we keep trying to invite people over to invade England is because we're all so occupied. So he gives that speech and he references something, America, some sort of deal with Cuba at the time that gives them some sort of semblance of sovereignty, and he references that, but then that annoys all the hardline Irish Americans because they don't want anything other than total peace, and it creates a big a mild scandal or whatever at that time. So he has to send McCartan, the guy we were just talking about there, he has to send him back to deal with that, and he gets replaced by Harry Boland. So it's after that he brings in Harry Boland as his number one money gun man in the States, and the two of them are traveling around. They raise about $5 million on the tour, which is an awful lot more than the Russians are getting. But in April of 1920, Dev makes a deal with the Russians, with the two delegates that are over there. These guys called Santeri Nuroteva and Ludwig Martens. I'll just go with Ludwig Martens because that's an easier word for me to pronounce. But so the Irish are raking in the money, and Dev basically makes a deal with these two ambassadors to give the Russians about $20,000 and for security against that money, they get the Russian crown jewels.
Amazing.
Which are given to Harry Boland personally. So I don't know why they had, well, maybe they got, I don't know. Well, anyway, so basically these guys can't raise any money from the Americans. They're much more sympathetic to the Irish, but Dev takes pity on them and gives them 20 grand in exchange for the Russian crown jewels. So they've been smuggled out of Russia. They were 4 brooches, gold, pearls, diamonds that belonged to the Romanov family, who were assassinated in 1917 after the revolution. So it's a bit great. This is only 3 years later.
Mm.
So I guess it's a bit... It's not exactly the soundest move by Dev. It's a bit grim to be handling these jewels at that stage. But so according to the receipt of the transaction at the time, they were worth 25,000, which I think I'm sure you have the same. Whenever you try and translate money from back then to now, it's hard to figure out what stuff is worth. But
A hell of a lot is...
yeah, like you gotta imagine the Russian crown jewels are worth... The fact that they came from a family who've been murdered only a couple of years previous, so it probably makes them worth more. So whatever it is it's presumably covered the 20 grand that he gives them. But so Harry Boland is like, he's left in charge of these jewels, and he brings them back to Ireland. He gets home on Stephen's Day of 1921, and he takes the jewels to his old friend Mick Collins. So apparently at that stage the two of them have a big argument. There's no one really knows, I suppose, at this stage what they're arguing about, but there is a receipt from the jewels signed by Colin on the 6th of January 1922. So the Anglo-Irish Treaty was ratified on the 7th. So this is the day before. So obviously, like, tensions are very high between the two guys.
Yeah,
and we'll talk about, the whole treaty. This is just as a backdrop to the whole big issue between the two of them. And then also there's their love affair with Kitty Kiernan. So the two men... Yeah, I guess tensions are high between the two of them, and now Boland's showing up at the last hour with these jewels. Like, Collins has enough stuff on his plate, I guess, with the treaty. Yeah. So I've also I've taken the
Russian crown jewels.
Yeah, just throw that in the mix as well to deal with that dead murdered family over in the Russians.
Especially when one of the things the British were concerned about, and it's something we forget about a little bit, was this risk that Ireland would fall to this communist tide.
Yes.
And it was one of the things that they wanted more reasonable people to come in and sign the treaty and keep it as a nice sort of capitalist country that didn't go nuts. And so I imagine rocking up with the crown jewels stolen by the communists isn't a great look in a tense time.
No, it's not a completely unfounded fear either when you look at who was involved in the rising.
No, not at all.
And, big Jim Larkin. But supposedly Collins says, I'm not going to bother with those things. They can't help us with our case at the moment. I don't want them. The Tsar and his family have been killed. There's blood on the jewels. Or something to that effect. I think he was, which is fair. I mean, like, it's easy to look back in this time and think that they were all sort of anti-royalist, anti-monarchist, but... If you covered the original, I don't know, there's what's his name, Prince Joachim the First. One of the initial plans for the Rising was like they go looking for a prince or a king to take them over, because they're still like, well, obviously you need a king.
Well, this was the Griffiths idea of matching the Hungarian approach and still having some kind of monarch.
Yeah, I guess basically, they're not all rabid like anti-royalists. I don't know why I'm going to Lenz to explain to be like, you know what, he might have actually thought it was unsound that Boland had these jewels he'd seen Anastasia, and he was it's like, maybe we shouldn't have taken these. So whatever happened anyway, like they have a bit of a falling out. Boland leaves with a receipt for the jewels, so we have that as proof of the interaction or whatever. The Collins signed it that he doesn't want them. So Boland leaves with them. He keeps them safe. He does what any man would do in that situation. He's entrusted with some fairly important bits of jewellery here, so he brings them to his mother. She'll know what to do. Yes. So they grew up, I think you said he was born in Phibsborough. I have it that he must have spent some time where they grew up in a house in Clontarf as well.
Yes, he was born in Phibsborough and then they moved to Clontarf when he was a bit older, I think.
Yes.
Because I think do you want the fun fact, or will I give away the fun fact?
Are we going to say... We can say it at the same time. They lived in the same house.
As Bram Stoker.
That'll
we can edit that so it
sync up perfectly. But it's very topical. We're doing this. This has probably come out around Halloween. So, yeah, the same... I only found out over the summer that Bram is short for Abraham.
Huh.
There you go. Yeah, because you
sense.
don't really hear Bram much anymore. But so 15 Merino Crescent in Clontarf. This is where Boland's mom lived, and it's also where Bram lived at some point. So his mother, you kind of talked about their Republican they're a big Republican family, and they're no stranger to you know, if there's any family that's not going to bat an eyelid at their son showing up with, you know,
With some
crown
jewels.
of recently communist Russia, like, oh, all right, we've got just the place. So the house has often been used as a safe house for like the lads over the course of the War of Independence. There's a step ladder that supposedly went out onto the skylight, went through a skylight onto the roof so that people could escape across the rooftops. Supposedly it was one of the storage sites for the Hoth gun running as well. So perfect place to store the jewelries. Apparently they were kept in different places around the house, but there's like a secret container or compartment in the chimney where they stored them for many years.
I wonder, did she ever feel tempted to wear them out on a night out?
Oh, you'd have to.
You have to
Surely.
just once.
Just
Like-
once. Yeah. Yeah, you definitely have to like just wear them out in the town once or twice. But yeah, we can talk about the end of the Russian crown jewels a little bit later, but that's pretty much, yeah, so Boland gets entrusted with them and hides them in his mother's house. But Marino is this, I only ever talk about this because I just love how it sounds, but Marino is also home of the Marino Casino. Did you ever see that in your travels around Clontarf?
No.
It's just like a folly. It's in a park in Marino, but it's called the Marino Casino. And so there's a series of tunnels, secret tunnels underneath it that Collins and Boland and the boys used during the War of Independence. So supposedly they used them to test machine guns, the Tommy guns we were talking about earlier on. They used these tunnels to test them out in. But so did you want to talk about the love triangle between?
Well, I was going to segue. I think maybe a good way to segue into that is, so obviously Boland had spent quite a lot of time in the States with Dev, going around, making his money, kind of causing trouble between the American Republican movement. Dev and Boland did not do a great job of unifying that group. But he's doing all of this and is kind of away from the country while Collins is involved in the treaty negotiations, while the war is getting worse and worse. Mm-hmm. And so I always find it really interesting to sort of what if and imagine if Boland hadn't been in the States with Dev, would he have maybe been more on side with Collins and the treaty, or was he always just coming from that hardline Republican background that he would never going to bend? But either whatever happened, when he arrives back in Ireland, it is to this tension with Collins, supposedly his best friend, and you do see the letters that he writes about Collins. They seem to they love each other. They compliment each other a lot. It's nuts. But obviously, so they were split on the treaty. They'd argued about the crown jewels, but then famously, there's the love triangle. If there wasn't enough drama in all of this, to begin with, you throw in a love triangle.
It is fascinating that they're like friendships forged on the battlefield, and they spend this time locked up in a camp together, and then basically, as best friends, take two diverging paths, like the polar opposites at the time. One goes to London to like get heavily involved in treaty negotiations, and the other goes to the States, where he's just surrounded by. And there is an element of like, you know, the Irish American Fenians are getting annoyed, but like they don't live there. You know what I mean? Like
they were generally more Republican. They were more hardline because they weren't on the ground seeing the realities of the fact that Ireland wasn't going to win.
And it's almost a beautiful split between like Boland and Dave go to the like ideological, hardlined, never actually have to live in the place, you know, fantasy land, and Collins goes to the actual what it's going to have to look like.
And it's not inevitable like that would have happened to either of them. Like, no. I always find it interesting that Collins was very anti-Griffith originally. He thought Griffith was too soft and too not hardline enough. And over time, Collins, the practical thinker that he was, came around to the stepping stones idea, while Boland never did.
But Boland's just hanging out with like Dev and raising money for all these people who've become very far removed from the, you know, what's happening back in Ireland. But it's a great setup for a story. Even there's a famous photo of the two of them. Well, we were just looking at the start there, the photo of the three boys, Collins, Dev and Boland together. There's all that series of photos of Collins and Boland at Crow Park, like throwing in I was trying to find what match it's from. I think it's the Leinster hurling final, but they're throwing the slitter in to open the game, and they're best pals, and then they head off on these diverging paths. And while Collins is in London and Boland's in America, they're both writing love letters to the same woman back home. They're both writing letters to Kitty Kiernan, which
you wouldn't write it if you were writing this as a movie.
Yeah,
it almost doesn't seem believable.
It doesn't, because I'm sure a lot of people watched the Michael Collins film and thought that that's tacked on for just added Hollywoodness. Now, if I was writing the movie, I wouldn't necessarily cast Julia Roberts as the Irish love interest of these two men, but it's crazy. So the two of them meet. They know Kitty Kiernan from the Kiernan Family Hotel, the Greenville Arms in Longford. So I don't know which. They presumably both know of the other's interests. I'm not sure about that. But when Boland's in the States, he basically writes a letter to Kiernan offering her kind of the golden package, I guess, for that time period. Where it's like, let's get married, move to the States. I have connections here. Just kind of like very tantalizing, I'd imagine, in the 1920s of like, let's get out of war-torn Ireland and go to,
You would have taken Boland up on the offer, is what you're saying.
It certainly sounds appealing, but apparently she also got Boland's mother sent a letter to Kitty as well, congratulating her on an engagement to her son, and signed the letter, your future mother-in-law, even though there was
she seems like a weapon of a woman. I love Boland's mother.
Absolutely. And this is, again, the same woman. She's going to show up at Kitty's door wearing the Russian crown jewels, being like, I need that. I need this wedding to happen. She's not a woman you want to cross. But so while that's happened, simultaneously, Collins is writing a letter to Kiernan every day from London. So she doesn't write back. She doesn't write back every day, apparently. But apparently she also never responds to Boland at all. So he kind of gets the hint from that. Which means, I don't know how involved the three of them were together before they left their separate ways, but Collins wins the race anyway. So between the two of them, I guess he wins her over with his constant letters. But that's another. So the first time they see each other then afterwards is with this Russian crown jewels thing. So it's the same, it's like a lot of fights. We've all been there. Heated debate. It's not about the jewels, man. It's not. That's just a proxy. The real Jew is Kitty Kiernan.
It's not even about the treaty at this point.
It's not about the treaty. It's not. It's about love, which is just great. So that all comes to a head in that January where the two of them meet each other again for this like meeting about what to do with the jewels. Presumably the conversation about like, why were you texting my girl while you're in the States? But anyway, so this all leads into the treaty, the signing of the treaty, the ratification of the treaty, and then the war.
And I think that's where we can joke about these things, and it's a fascinating, the love triangle. It's sort of disagreement over disagreement over disagreement. But where it gets sad is, and I think because at the moment the show we're very buried in the nitty gritty of the Civil War, and it is, I think, one of the reasons Boland and Collins captures the imagination so much is because it is that perfect sort of encapsulation of the split. You have these best friends split over love and split over politics. And Boland immediately sides with the anti-treaty and Dev, which makes sense. As we said, he had been surrounded by hardline Republicans in the States. He'd been with Dev constantly. And he really doesn't have that many nice things to say about Dev when he gives one speech against the treaty saying, I rise to speak against this treaty because, in my opinion, it denies a recognition of the Irish nation. I object to it on the ground of principle, and my chief objection is because I am asked to surrender the title of Irishman and accept the title of West Britain. I object because this treaty denies the sovereignty of the Irish nation. I stand by the principles I have always held, that the Irish people are by right a free people. I object to this treaty because it is the very negation of all that for which we have fought. And he goes further than that. A few months later, in a letter around July 27th, Boland writes that the country is now under a dictatorship is now the rule, and that Mick, Dick and Oney have attempted to usurp the function of Parliament. So he really swings against Collins, even as... so he's very anti-treaty, but what we always reiterate with Boland, he was such a he was loved by all sides. He was such a popular man. He was such a friendly guy, for want of a better term. He spends a lot of 1922 trying to bring the sides together. He was seen as a more reasonable anti-treatyite.
Yeah.
And he's really hoping that the Civil War doesn't descend into violence. But sadly, that's not really how it goes down.
It's an interesting point that he is the kind of poster boy for... Yeah, I mean, it's the same with every Civil War, but you always hear that, like, brothers against brothers, fathers against sons is literally... this extended revolutionary period from 1916 to 1921. It's this group that have fought with each other side by side against the British Empire, and then within the space of 2 or 3 months turn against each other. And these two best friends who are now basically high up leaders on either side of the Civil War. But I see a lot of quotes of him like being touted as a sort of voice of reason, trying to get everyone back together around the table to talk it out.
Yes, and so he was acting as that kind of, he was trying to be that key player and trying to mend the split. And he didn't really, my understanding is he didn't really do a lot of fighting, but he was briefly the quartermaster of the anti-treaty IRA.
Yes.
Probably because of his history as a gun runner and a man who got you arms.
Yeah.
But he wasn't like, say, Liam Lynch or that, who was really leading fighters.
Yeah. Apart from that one time that he was leading fighters, but yes. yeah, he's more of a negotiator, an ambassador, I guess. He's kind of, there's weird stories that seems simultaneously, I don't know, a man on the run and also a man about town. If that, like, he's kind of, we'll talk about it, I guess, as we get closer to his spoilers, but he dies. But he's kind of this weird dichotomy in that he's, it's very wanted figure on the far side of the treaty, wanted by the government, but he's also just hanging around town,
it seems like a very
public meetings.
It seems a very classic, like, Irish way to be on the run. Like,
yeah, sure,
sure, I'm on the run, haven't I? Like,
I'm only on the run at the weekends, though. During the week, I'm mostly hanging around Clontarf. But so yeah, they after the forecourts, they surrounded the forecourts. The Republican forces take over Blessington in Wicklow. So this is around like July 1922 when this is Boland's, I think, his only military sort of hands-on experience. He's the quartermaster there, but that's finished by the 5th of July. They recaptured the town. Joe McGrath and the national troops take it over. Harry's brother Gerald, who was one of the founders of Fianna Fáil, he gets captured, but Harry escapes. And by the middle of July 1922, like, the city, this is again getting into the, like, this area surrounded. The government's mopping up dissident anti-treatyites around the place, but Boland's going between. He's supposedly like sleeping rough in the hills of Dublin, sleeping around the Wicklow Mountains. At some point during this period, he writes, "Can you imagine me on the run from Mick Collins? It's ludicrous." And he also writes shortly after that saying, "I will be the first to be killed because Mick knows that I know too much about him." So
and so you can start really hearing how that relationship seems to have soured a little bit.
That's what war will do to two boys, I guess. But so from this, I guess July is this sort of transition period where he goes from, he's getting involved in the military leadership. He's now on the run, properly on the run, hiding out in the mountains, writing little notes in his diary about how Mick is going to kill him. So
and this is reflected across the country where the Civil War wasn't one big moment. It kind of simmered for a few months, and it looked like maybe we could avoid it, maybe we could not. And then in around July, post the election where the provisional government felt like they had a mandate, they started cracking down a little bit, and things got serious because of a whole lot of reasons that we don't need to get into now, but down to pressure from the British, down to the anti-treaty side acting up a little bit more. But yeah, it means that as Harry then gets more involved in that side, he is sadly not long for this earth.
Yes. So at the end of July, Saturday, July 30th, and this is where he goes from this, gaucho Spanish Civil War, like living in the foothills. They just sort of gives up on that, and now he's spotted in the city. He's dining in Jamet's restaurant that evening, so he's just in the city again, I guess. Maybe they do get the weekends off. Yeah,
you're gonna get tired. You want to go to get nice dinner eventually.
Sure. So this his movements are very public that day. He gets a train in the afternoon from Amiens Street, which is later Connolly Station, which I guess is funny they hadn't renamed them at that point. Maybe it was still Amiens Street Station, but that's a little fact for people. All the stations in the south are named after the dead 1916 revolutionaries. But so he's either accompanied by a man or followed by one. It's unclear at this point. So there's a couple of different scenarios as to what happened next. He ends up in Skerries anyway. He gets off the train at Skerries. One suggestion is that this is just a distraction to hide his real destination. His real destination may be to meet Joe McAlevey in Belfast, which seems unlikely as McAlevey was in Mountjoy prison at that point. But
that'll do it.
But yeah, so maybe he was intended to head all the way to Belfast to meet up with someone and then hopped off. Another theory is that he was supposed to meet Michael Collins, who was in Dundalk at that time, investigating the Dundalk prison break, which we covered on our own show, is a very funny period of the Civil War. Have you gotten to that part yet?
No, tell me more.
It's made the jail. We actually, myself and Jason, got to do a live episode there last year for the centenary of the breakout in the jail. It's now like a music venue. But basically the two sides just would break into the jail and arrest the other side and put them in prison, and then just switch over back and forth 3 or 4 times in the space of a week. So it was, so Collins is up there dealing with that at that point. So it suggests that this could be a secret meeting with Boland going up to meet him, and then also finding out. So Collins will come back to Dublin, finding that out halfway and hopping off the train to get to Skerries. There's also mentions that he was going to meet with Frank Thornton or Joe McGrath. So there's some, maybe this is meant to be some meeting.
And Frank Thornton being one of the senior members of the sort of the intelligence services, the Irish intelligence services.
Yes.
And related to the squad. So again, secret meetings maybe. Yeah,
with Collins or Collins related men.
Yeah.
Which I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, people seem to be pointing to the evidence that he was very public and open with his movements to imply that it's a secret meeting. Doesn't make any sense. The fact that he was so blatant about his movements must mean that he was meeting up with Collins's men. But
if I understand it right, we really don't know. We just know that he was in the Skerries hotel, and the government forces found out about this. They knew he was there.
But we found out about it, and you've mentioned it, that he was using an alias in the States. He's no stranger to spymanship.
They've been on the run a lot. They've
been on the run. He's pulled a James Bond move here where he walks into Skerries Hotel and he's like, the name's Boland, Harry Boland, check under B.
Do you think there's a little bit of naivety here from him? Like, he's always painted as this optimist, as this positive guy. And I wonder, and this is me armchair psychologizing a man dead 100 years, but a sense similar to Collins, how Collins went down to Cork and was like, they won't shoot me in my own country.
Yeah.
I wonder, was there a sense that Boland didn't think that they would actually come for him? Even as he's writing, Mick will have me killed.
Yeah.
I wonder, did he believe it? Did he think that the war would get that bitter that quickly?
I don't think so. And then, well, as we'll talk about, maybe he was right. Like, maybe it wasn't meant to be, because this, just like everything leading up to this point, there's multiple scenarios that could have happened because we don't actually know. But basically, that night of July 31st, he books himself into the hotel. The national forces, the government forces, raid the hotel, and he gets shot and wounded, and he dies from his wounds the next day. But there's basically 2 trains of thought that it was an accident. Or that he tried to escape and was shot down. So it seems more likely that it was an accident, which does play into, like, maybe he was right to think that he could walk around and that he wouldn't be gunned down in the street. But then he accidentally was gunned down by an overzealous, inexperienced troop. Or maybe he was wrong and they did, follow him to the hotel and shoot him.
And there was a lot of confusion, or a lot of, again, myth making done around who had killed him, because
for sure,
immediately the anti-treaty started using this as a propaganda thing, and which is kind of, there's maybe something poetic in this, in that Harry Boland was such the propagandist, such the storyteller, and as soon as even the way he speaks to his mother and his sister on his deathbed, and he says he knows who did it, but he won't say. It was a friend of his, and he doesn't want. There was a lot of if I understand it correctly, there were a lot of different accounts of what Harry Boland's last words were.
Yes.
But they all kind of play around that theme of, I know who killed me, he was a friend of mine, but I want you to forgive him, and I don't want any repercussions for the man.
Which is also, and this is pure, if we're getting into armchair 100 years ago stuff, it's also possible that his mother and his sister are no strangers to this game either. It's possible that his last dying words were fuck, oh fuck, ow, shit, they got me. And that they spin this kind of like, this Civil War myth of like, I know who it was a friend. I was kissed in the garden by Judas, but I don't want any repercussions. Like that's, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but that was also a kind of very powerful story for that time during the Civil War.
And you could imagine his mother, Kate Boland, again, she was a serious Republican. She came from a long line of Fenian stock. They knew how to use a martyr. They knew how to use a death to their cause. You can totally imagine her coming up with this story of trying to bring together what she is watching these young men fracture around her and start killing each other. Yeah. You can imagine her trying to use the death as a means of maybe bringing people together, which was what Boland had been trying to do that whole year anyway.
Sure, yeah. Kathleen is his sister as well. She says that he told her it was a man that he'd been locked up with after the Easter Rising. So it's possible it's all true and this is how it happens, but it is also, again, it's like good at this sort of turning or crucial point of the Civil War that it's this call to like, it was a man I was locked up with after we did the 1916 Rising. Oh, it was one of my brothers in arms that it was him that shot me. And it's just kind of really highlights the...
And I think what's so sad is we do have what Collins wrote about it. He wrote to Kitty Kiernan about Boland's death. And what he says is, it's just, it does get you. He writes, I passed Vincent's hospital and saw a crowd outside. My mind went into him, Harry, lying there dead, and I thought of the times together. I had sent a wreath. I suppose they would return it torn up.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't speak of someone who's like, yes, we got the bastard.
Oh, for
we're
sure.
winning this war.
Yeah.
You can feel that, like, the sadness in from all sides.
Yeah. This is his friend.
Yeah.
They went to the hurling together.
And the funeral, again, classic of these Republican funerals, was huge.
And biggest funeral of all time. Every funeral, the biggest funeral of all time.
But what was sad, it feels like in 22, it was a bit like that. It was like, this is the biggest funeral yet. This is Harry Boland is dead. If we've killed Harry Boland, like, it can't get worse than that.
Yeah.
And then within a month, Griffith is dead, and they have an even bigger funeral. And oh my God, Griffith is dead. It can't get worse than that.
Yeah.
And within a few weeks, Collins is dead, and it's the biggest funeral yet. Like, I think what sometimes we forget is how quickly this all happened. How many of these senior leaders from both sides were gone. And some of the, like, Boland, as much as Collins, was a super intelligent, super good organizer, a great pop propagandist, a great, like, he had been around the States telling a lot of stories. It just seems like quite a loss to the Irish, this new Irish country, that he was to die when we kind of needed the likes of Boland and Collins. And I think people focus on Collins a lot because he's obviously the big guy. He's got the movie about him. But so many other people died that we really needed as well. And I think that's part of the tragedy of the whole thing.
Yeah, I think Harry Boland kind of always gets overshadowed by Collins in his life, but it is that, because it's the same, he's got a mysterious death, which is all these intriguing, it's perfect fodder for storytelling, but it comes, just a couple of weeks before Collins gets assassinated in his own mysterious manner, and that kind of trumps Boland again. But the summer of 1922, I guess, is a big one for the New Republic.
A grim old time.
So
that's kind of Boland's story there. We've crammed it together very quickly and not done the man justice. But from, like, old school Republican stock, part of the fringe the whole way through, who rises up the ranks, does a lot of good work in America, raises a lot of money, and has this amazing relationship with Collins throughout that really typifies the split. And so that's his story. But if I'm right in saying it's not quite the end of the story, in that the jewels come back in later.
The jewels come back in later. I realize I'd written a lot about this for the end, but basically, yeah, so he refuses to tell his sister Kathleen who shot him, but he does supposedly say, hang on to the jewels until a party comes into power that can bring about a united Ireland. So they hang on to the jewels until 1938, when De Valera is back in power with Fianna Fáil. And at that point, Kathleen hands over the jewels to him. Dev's secretary is also her brother at the time, like Gerald Boland. So they figure it's fine. They get a receipt for the jewels, which comes in handy a couple of years later, because basically public opinion massively shifts against Russia in the 30s. In the early 1920s, when this other stuff's happening, there's still sort of sympathies towards the communist movement, the workers' struggle, the Soviet way of life. By the time the jewels come up again in the late 30s and 1940s, the Catholic Church has really turned people against communism. So by the time they come back up again, they're much more of a secretive thing. And basically, so she hands them back in 1938, and it's a decade later in 1948. Politicians basically just, the short version of the story is people start slinging abuse at each other about being communists. And at some point, Patrick McCartan,
a popular thing
it's
to do
as popular today as it was back then. We're just calling people commie. At some point in this back and forth, Patrick McCartan, who we talked about earlier, comes up and he's like, well, what about the time Dev took the Russian crown jewels and gave them 20 grand? And this is 1948, and this is the first time it comes into public discourse that the Russians owe us 20 grand and that we have the crown jewels. So when Kathleen Boland hands them back over, she gets this receipt, and supposedly she's like extremely delighted to have gotten the receipt, because it's 10 years later, and the finger is pointed at her and, you know, her deceased brother Harry, that they kept the money or that they still have the jewels, and she's able to whip out the receipt and be like, I gave them back to Dev 10 years ago, so he's the one you need to be talking to here. And then he publicly acknowledges them, and then there's kind of a long... He acknowledges that they have them. The Russians don't acknowledge that this ever happened for quite a while. So basically, they eventually get the money back and hand the jewels back to the Russians.
But it's a lot less money back, though.
A lot less money back. I think they get... Eventually, it gets to saving face territory, and they get close to the... They get close to the original amount that they handed over, but there's no regard for inflation that had happened in the remaining 50 years or whatever.
Joseph Stalin and the communists, famous for not caring too much about inflation.
Exactly. By the time they're trying to hammer it out, Stalin, you know, a famously reasonable man, is in charge of Russia. So they're kind of happy to get what they get. And then the Jews get sent back to Russia. And in 1988, Kathleen Boland's daughter, Eileen Barrington, so Harry's niece, Eileen, she travels to Russia to see the jewels. She'd grown up in Clontarf, where the jewels would have been stored, and she would have seen them as a kid. So she goes to look at them, and the Russians sort of deny any existence of them. They go to the Kremlin, where there are jewels in display. They don't match up to the picture that she has of these jewels. So it's just another final little bit of the mystery, is like, whose jewels
did Harry have the whole time?
What the hell were they? Did we just give the Russians 20 grand for no reason? If they were the real jewels, where did they end up? They don't seem to go back to Russia. Far be it from Russia to be involved in some sort of sneaky subterfuge. But yeah, that's the final bit of the story, is Harry's niece heads over to go see them in the Kremlin and can't find them.
Amazing. So that's Harry Boland and the Russian crown jewels. I think he's such a fascinating character that, as I said, I've been guilty of having to leave on the chopping floor. And I think the crown jewels are such an interesting side plot, I guess, to his life, but a great example of a fascinating story, and one that gives us a lot of facets into what was going on in Ireland at the time, but we don't tell a lot. And I think that's just mirrors poor Harry Boland's existence. He gets forgotten about, even though he was so important and such an interesting, gregarious, friendly, and energetic person. Like, I don't think the movement would have done as well or would have gotten as far without the likes of Boland.
No. Especially when you consider that the other, charismatic, charming face of the movement is Dev.
Yeah.
It's like without Boland, if Dev is one of the main voices out there,
you're in trouble.
Yeah, it's a lot less palatable. But yeah, he's an interesting man.
Yeah, that was I found it a fascinating chat. And for the people who listen to my show and maybe haven't heard yours, that's the stories like that about the Russian crown jewels is just the kind of stuff that pops up on Shite Talk history all the time that I love.
Yeah. People are always messaging us asking, like, why do you don't do any Civil War stuff anymore? Is it, well, we kind of avoid the exact stuff you're covering because it's so in depth, and we kind of focus on the more salacious. We're the tabloid news of podcasts. You know? We focus on who's banging Kitty Kiernan and who's robbed the crown jewels, whereas you do a very, very good job of covering the actual history aspects of a very important period of Irish history. So between the two of us, yeah, you've got, if you listen to your show, then you've got the context to understand some of the stupid jokes that we make about 1919.
And if you need a break from all the grim Civil War period stuff, then you can go listen to your show and learn about Joe Dolan and the
Joe Dolan is a fascinating man. Talk about Harry Boland, man, Joe Dolan is such a bizarre story.
Well, it's been a pleasure to chat to you and do a proper grown up sign off, and maybe we'll do another one again sometime after a lot of
sure. Yeah, we were gonna do Casement. We could do
Yates.
I'd love to do Yates again. Mostly because all the notes are already written up, so it'll be easy. But we could do Jack and William Butler,
the Yates brothers.
Yeah, the great perverts of the 1920s. But I better go. Actually, I've got a
I was just going to say